Welcome everyone. I hope you are doing well. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Marian and I'm an international marketing specialist at the University of Tartu. I am very happy to welcome you to the Alumni Talks 2023 event, and I will be your host today. Alumni Talks is our new series where our fantastic alumni share their story of studying at the University of Tartu, and they will give a short lecture on a topic they chose. And today I am here with Alastair. So Alastair Forbes is actually the program manager of clinical nutrition and the visiting professor of medicine at the University of Tartu. He has an international reputation in specialist clinical nutrition, and he has led nutrition teams in the UK. And today he is going to talk about nutritional screening, which is creating a unique screening tool that is completely automated. So now just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, please leave them to the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please write us in the chat box and we will try to help you resolve them. And also we are going to record today's talk, and all participants will receive a recording after the webinar. But now, without further ado, I would like to give a floor to our presenter, Alastair. So please, if you're ready, you can start.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. Good evening to those of you that are in Europe and Africa. Whatever time of day it is, if you're somewhere else, have a good day there too. I'm going to talk this evening about the research program that we're working on, that you just heard about, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the master's program, because that's very important for us in terms of our future and what we hope will be a healthy future for international nutrition. So I'm going to share my screen now, if that's going to work, and we'll show you some slides that I've got that illustrate what I'm aiming to talk about. So hopefully you should now see my screen. And with a little bit of luck, you'll all be seeing a screen that says something along the lines of Masters in Clinical Nutrition, which, as I say, is the main overarching theme for my talk. And the component about the research program will be developed and built into that. So the Masters in Clinical Nutrition is based here in Tartu in Estonia. And as you've heard, I'm the course director. My background is in gastroenterology originally, but over the last 10 to 15 years, I've done less and less gastroenterology and more clinical nutrition. And the idea of setting up in Tartu was an opportunity, and you'll see that the opportunities are great from what I have to say. For those of you who don't know, Tartu is the second city of Estonia. It's also the academic capital of Estonia. And the Tartu University is the only university in Estonia that's in the world's top 300. And that really is quite a considerable achievement when you think that there are literally tens of thousands of universities. To be in the top 300 is really quite a substantial achievement of the university and its staff. The Masters in Clinical Nutrition is intended as a demanding but also rewarding and also, I hope, entertaining course. And it's the only English language course that focuses entirely on clinical nutrition anywhere in the European Union. And I say that because of Brexit, of course, because I did establish, in conjunction with one of my colleagues there, a similar master's course in London that still exists and is very successful, but is different from the Tartu one for several important reasons, not least the fact that the London course is only 1 year and costs about 5 times as much, but we'll come to that. So our master's here in Estonia is a 2-year course And that comes with the full 120 credits, the ECTs, that are recognized internationally as important evidence of academic attainment. The first year of the course is predominantly a taught course based on lectures, seminars, tutorials, and a great deal of practical interaction. It's taught in English. The second year is largely taken up with the research project, where the opportunity for the student to do their own thing, to do an in-depth piece of research on something that interests them, together with an internship where they're attached to a clinical department, again, somewhere of their choice, although we'll help to find somewhere suitable, and that can be in Tartu or elsewhere. We also have an elective when there's an opportunity to do something completely different. And shortly before the final exam and the submission of the master's thesis, there's a breaking news section where we have a whole module devoted to things that have only just recently been reported in the literature, and to a large extent also at national and international meetings. So it's absolutely brand new and bound to be different each year. The teaching methods we use are deliberately highly interactive, and there's a great deal of interplay between the teachers and the students. We use lots of different assessment methods as well, including frequent in-course assessments. I think the present group of students might tell you that they have in-course assessment every day, but we also use essays and multiple choice questions. And so for each module, there is some sort of formal assessment, which is usually in the form either of a multiple choice question paper at the end of the module or an essay at the end of the module. And that runs through the first year. And then in the second year, the main test of achievement is the submission of the master's thesis and an end of course examination. In addition to that, we're conscious to give the students an opportunity to feed back on the teaching. So again, at regular intervals, typically every 6 weeks, we do a 360-degree evaluation where the students are given the opportunity to assess us as well as us assessing the students. So we try to be responsive to that, and not only to be reactive, but to try and take advantage of things that we're told that allow us to improve the course as it goes along. That's the main historic central building of the university, and that's right in the city centre. It's quite an elegant building, as you can see. This is the Biomedicum building, which is the basic medical sciences building, which is on the health campus, which is about, I suppose, about 2 kilometres from the city centre. And it's where the main hospital is, which you see in the next slide. This is the Clinicum, so the main Tartu University Hospital. And in fact, because our course is so clinically orientated, this is where the majority of our sessions take place. So that's the hospital from the outside, that's the main atrium at the inside of the hospital. So most of the hospital is pretty well brand new, very good condition, very well equipped. And you'll see some examples of that as we go through the slides further. So, malnutrition. Clinical nutrition is very much focused on malnutrition. Malnutrition in the most global sense simply means disordered nutrition, and therefore includes obesity and all the consequences of obesity. But our emphasis, not to ignore obesity, but our emphasis is on undernutrition and the effects of that on disease and the disease effect on the malnutrition. What is clear is that malnutrition is common, and it adds to the severity of most forms of disease. It increases morbidity, the level of sickness, if you like. It increases mortality, and it undoubtedly increases the human and the financial costs of illness. So malnutrition is really a very big deal, and it's responsible for probably in the region of 8 million deaths a year around the world. Unfortunately, malnutrition is often missed, or if it's not missed, it's neglected. And you might think that was somewhat scandalous, but it is a little bit understandable, because if someone presents to hospital with terribly severe end-stage liver disease, or even with a simpler thing like a bad episode of pneumonia, it's understandable that the clinicians put their efforts into looking after that underlying condition. But it does mean that the nutrition gets neglected. That then allows the nutrition to become more of a clinical problem. And so the patient ends up compromised by their malnutrition, and compromised further by the fact that the malnutrition hasn't been identified and treated. And the net effect of that is that whatever that underlying condition is more difficult to treat, takes longer to get them better. But healthcare systems are now beginning to realize that. They're beginning to realize that just from a simple cost effectiveness point of view, even just in terms of money, it's a bad move to miss malnutrition. So they are beginning to realize that, and that's true pretty well everywhere around the world, that malnutrition and its importance to health in general, in particular to hospital practice, is a realization that is dawning. However, as the healthcare systems recognize that, then they suddenly realize that if they want to do something about the nutrition, they've got to have someone to do something about it. And there is an unquestioned international deficit of professionals who know about malnutrition and, more importantly, still know how to treat it. So that expertise in clinical nutrition is very largely missing. It's missing amongst doctors, it's missing amongst healthcare staff in general. And in Estonia in particular, there's a deficit through there not being a major cadre of dietitians. So malnutrition beginning to be recognized, but with a gap. And so there's an obvious solution for that. And our obvious solution, naturally, is to create a master's and to create a group of students qualifying with an important academic qualification in clinical nutrition that they can then go forth and prosper and bring the message to the world and to begin to change the practice, not just through what they do personally, but very much as teachers, as role models and inspirers of others. So our masters has a strong local faculty, so it's very multidisciplinary. I coordinate it, I do quite a lot of the teaching, but the contributions from other departments are really, really important. And that means pretty well all of the clinical departments in the hospital, and also a panel of visiting international teachers. And you got a little selection of flags there to give you an idea of where some of those teachers come from. We've got that's just in this first year. We've got these group of international teachers from those various different countries. And these are all people that I know well. They're people that I know that I can rely on to be excellent lecturers, but not only excellent lecturers, but also enthusiastic supporters of clinical nutrition. And each of them works in their own centre of excellence. And so one of the purposes of not only introducing our students to good teachers, but also to introduce them to those teachers' departments at a distance, obviously, when it's just the lecturer coming and giving a talk, but the opportunity for our students then to go and visit and to do electives and internships in those other departments. And that can be anywhere that anyone wants to go. As examples, this is Mette Holst, who's a long-term colleague and collaborator of mine. She's by background a nurse who has been very influential in the development of clinical nutrition in Denmark, and particularly from the holistic whole patient point of view. So she's a clinical nutritionist with a nursing background who's now professor of clinical nutrition in Denmark. She was our visiting lecturer, I think in October, and spent 3 days with us giving seminars, tutorials, and interacting a lot with the students. A few weeks before that, we'd had Professor George Grimble, who's a long-term colleague of mine. I mentioned the London Master's course. It was George and I that set that up together. And you might wonder what on earth he's doing in this picture, but he is demonstrating his continuing thirst for knowledge and inquiry. And we took him to the Tartu Science Museum, so-called AHA, in order for him to learn a little bit more about the effects of gravity And you can see him trying out gravity there to see whether or not it works. We're also academically active in a variety of other ways. So the department has interests in acute mesenteric ischemia. That's an international research collaboration, actually started by colleagues here in Tartu, one of whom now is based in Switzerland, from which she coordinates a lot of this activity. So there's a missing Estonian flag there, but the German, Swiss, Swedish and Finnish flags are important. So it's an international collaboration, and that is probably the biggest study of acute mesenteric ischemia. It's not just one study, it's a whole series of interlinked studies, probably the biggest set of studies that has ever been done on acute mesenteric ischemia. That's funded, at least in part, by the Estonian Research Council. We're also very much involved in European guidelines, both in terms of inflammatory bowel disease and nutrition and intestinal failure and nutrition. And both of those are in conjunction with the European Society ESPEN. So that's very much an EU approach to trying to provide guidance to non-experts, trying to encourage expert groups to identify where the gaps are, where the failings are, where there's need for new research. And again, those are both things that I've been personally involved with for well over a decade now. We've got interests in probiotics. That includes colleagues in Greece, Italy, Poland, also the UK actually. And again, international research looking at the importance of probiotics in various aspects of nutritional support. The UK component there I didn't mention was and is an interest in nutrition in patients with spinal cord injury, which again is another massive study, and again the biggest one being done anywhere in the world. We're very interested in biomarkers of intestinal integrity. The Italian flag's particularly important there, because one of my previous PhD students became very interested in citrulline. We've got a collaboration again with excellent centres elsewhere, using a whole series of different things that might help us to understand how the intestine is functioning and when it's dysfunctional. And that clearly is of considerable importance to research background. And then we've got this local project of automated nutrition screening, which is the title of the talk, and so what some of you will have come hoping to hear more about. I'll try and explain a little bit of the background to that. The idea that malnutrition is a problem is not new. We've known since the 1970s that around about a third of all patients admitted to hospital have either overt malnutrition, undernutrition meaning, or are at very high risk of this developing during that hospital admission. The adverse consequences of that are very well documented. We know that in just about every respect that you can measure, the patient who is malnourished does worse. But we also know that it's often completely missed. And so a little bit as an aside, but if I take you to one of our clinical departments in the hospital here in Tartu, we can go to the intensive care unit and we can look at some of the things that we need to do from a nutritional point of view in our patients with severe nutritional failure. This is my colleague here, Professor Starkov, and he's showing you the indirect calorimeter. So this is a way of measuring the amount of energy a patient needs. It does it by measuring the amount of oxygen that's being consumed and the amount of carbon dioxide that's being produced, which gives you an opportunity to do a direct calculation of the energy requirements of that patient. And it's not just Yoel and myself, we also got our master's students on the case. So these are the master's students on the intensive care unit, wearing appropriate protective garments, as you can see, using the indirect calorimeter on a real patient. And obviously for confidentiality aspects, you can't see the patient, but the patient is poking in the back. I don't know whether you can see my mouse marker there, but the patient is on the bed there. You can see, probably just about to see his feet there somewhere. So the patient is there. We're just about to measure his energy requirement. He was a substantially obese patient, And it's often quite difficult in obesity to know how much nutrition someone needs. What we do know is that obese people also very rapidly become malnourished from an undernutrition point of view when they're seriously ill. Obviously, the intensive care is a place where people are seriously ill. And it can be quite difficult to know how much nutrition to give. The indirect calorimeter helps us to do that. So what about nutrition screening? Nutrition screening is a way of helping the institution to identify the people who are at risk, identifying the people who've got malnutrition that might otherwise be missed. So it's something that's done in addition to whatever's being done in terms of their underlying disease. So to give the examples I gave before, the patient with severe end-stage liver disease or the patient with bad pneumonia, they're in hospital for that reason, and the clinicians are focused correctly on those things, but they're forgetting about the nutrition. So what we're trying to do is to introduce something that is simple and quick, that allows us to say, this patient has got a problem with malnutrition. Please do something about it. We know that you're focused, we know that you're busy doing all the other things, but we want just to identify that the patient's got malnutrition and we want to do something about it. So if that's going to work, it's got to be something that can be done with very little training and minimal time commitment. So it's got to be something ideally that can be done by the sort of healthcare assistant, the nurses' assistants, the people who've got very, very little in the training. They're there, they're available, and hopefully we can get them to do this really quite well. That's been something that's been looked at and actively pursued across Europe and across the world, really for the last maybe 25, getting on for 30 years now. And we've got a number of screening tools that allow us to do this. And generally speaking, those tools have three components. They've got a bit about the patient's history, which is usually have they lost weight, a bit about their present status, and a bit about our future expectations for them. Is this something that's going to get better, or are they going to have a continuing problem? So the history is predominantly, is there a history of weight loss? Their present status will look at their weight or their body mass index. And the future expectations are, for example, the patient who is completely well, that's in a bad road accident that damages their face or their head, so that they can't eat. They weren't malnourished at all, but because they can't eat, because they've got a facial injury, they're going to be in trouble. And we need to identify that patient, someone who's got a nutrition problem. And as well as my teaching in the university, I try to make sure that I act as a role model as much as I can, and we're trying to make sure that things start early in Estonia. So I'll give you an example of nutrition education now starting in regular schools. So this is a group of 8 and 9-year-olds learning about body mass index calculation. They know that they need to measure the patient's height, measure the patient's weight, and carefully record it and do the calculation. So we're making sure that nutrition education starts early, and that these are children who are going to grow up knowing about and thinking about nutrition as something important. There are future students as well, of course. So what are these screening tools like? What are the sort of questions they ask? This is one that's very, very widely used internationally. It's called the NRS, the Nutrition Risk Screening, and it's got the number because that's the date it was published in. And it starts with 4 simple questions. Is the body mass index less than 20.5? Yes or no? Has the patient lost weight during the last 3 months? Yes or no? Was the dietary intake reduced? Anyway, you can read it. So 4 questions. Takes seconds to ask the questions, a little bit longer if you have to work out the body mass index if someone hasn't already done that, but really pretty quick. If the answer to all those questions is no, and I know that you're now thinking to yourself, oh, what about me? Is my BMI, have I lost? So very, very simple questions. If the answer to all 4 questions is no, you don't need to worry anymore. That patient is low risk. If the answer to even one of those questions is yes, then you need to ask some more questions, which is what with this particular tool is called the final screening. And that adds scores for nutritional status and for the severity of the underlying disease. So you get a score of somewhere between 0 and 3 for the combination of weight loss, low food intake, or low body mass index. And you also get a score of 0 to 3 according to the severity of your disease. and that can be mild disease for someone that's got a background of perhaps someone who's a well-controlled diabetic, but because they've got a chronic disease, that would be considered mild disease, whereas someone who's desperately ill in the intensive care unit would be considered severe with a score of 3. And because we know that older patients do worse from a nutrition point of view and are also more likely to have malnutrition, the patient who's over 70 gets an additional score. So you can have a score of anywhere between 0 and 7. And if the total score is 3 or more, then that tells us that there's an indication for proper assessment and probably for nutritional support. So very simple, ought to be very practical, ought to be something that every hospital everywhere can do with good results. And when it's done well, that's exactly what happens. Better identification of high-risk patients, higher rates of referral to the nutrition services. So the patient's identified, oh, we thought you'd like to know about this patient. We think they're high risk for nutrition. Would you like to see them? Perhaps they need something done. Higher rates of appropriate intervention, lower complication rates, which includes shorter length of stay, and ultimately lives saved. So literally patients' lives being saved as a consequence of doing this nutrition screening. So it's fantastic. And in some countries, it's been thought so important and so fantastic that it's been made mandatory. That's true, for example, in Denmark and the UK. And a patient who's admitted to hospital has to have this done, in theory. The trouble is, it is very, very difficult to implement it in a way that is sustainable. It requires a whole load of education and reinforcement. And typically, if you have an education program, you go around all the wards, you tell everyone about it, you put flyers up, you go around chatting with people in lunch breaks, coffee breaks, and everyone gets enthused about it. And you'll get a well-completed account in 85, even occasionally 90% of the patients. But very, very quickly, that tails off. And that's true even when it's supposedly mandatory. And then someone else will come along with some other current priority. It's been COVID, hasn't it? So that's one thing. People are all worried about COVID. They're not thinking about nutrition screening. But it can be other things, simpler things like saying, for example, that it's important to screen for the risk of thrombosis. Suddenly the focus goes on to thrombosis, and the successful completion of nutrition screening goes from 85% down to 65%, and if you're really unlucky, below 50%. And there's one Danish study where they're actually rather good at this, that showed it was correctly, properly, and fully done in only 15% of people. So there is a problem with it. We know that when it's done well, it's really helpful. But there's clearly an important need for alternatives. What are the alternatives? What else could we do? Well, we could measure nutrition risk in some other way. Perhaps what we need is some numbers. So we can measure skin folds. So we can use the Harpenden caliper. This looks like a thing out of a medieval torture room, doesn't it? But it's not quite as bad as it seems. It's a way of assessing the amount of subcutaneous fat there is, and that's showing it in action. You pinch the upper arm about halfway down its length. You try to do it exactly halfway down its length. Pull the skin out about 1 centimeter, gently release the caliper, continue holding the skin while you're making the reading. It's a very good way of assessing someone's body composition. The trouble is that, like many of these things, firstly, it takes time, and secondly, it takes experience in order to get reproducible results. So if you've got someone that's really enthusiastic about doing it and does it well and does it often, you can get lots of good results. But in the context of general screening, really not helpful. It's not something that's a practical screening option. So what about using blood tests? Patients in hospital have lots of blood tests. Maybe there are blood tests that would tell us the answer. And there are two particular screening tools that had been developed on that basis: the Prognostic Nutritional Index and the Glasgow score. So first of all, the Prognostic Nutritional Index, that uses the serum albumin and the lymphocyte count, so the particular type of white cells in the blood. You simply add the two together. Well, you have to multiply the lymphocyte count by 0.005 first, but that's not terribly difficult with a calculator. Add the two together, higher scores are better, and the threshold for worse outcomes is somewhere between 45 and 50, depending on which paper you look at. So quite simple to do. The modified Glasgow prognostic score. Also quite simple to do. In this case, you look at the albumin and the C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker in the blood. And if both of them are abnormal, so less than 35 is low and abnormal, more than 10 is high and abnormal. And if you've got the low albumin and a high CRP, you get a score of 2. If it's only the CRP that's greater than 10, you get a score of 1. Any other results, so an abnormal albumin on its own or both being normal, you get a score of 0. So again, quite simple to do, but the problem is that neither of them correlate very well with nutritional status. Both of them give a bit of an indication of overall prognosis. So if you've got a bad score on either of those, you're more likely to die, you're more likely to end up on intensive care, those kind of things. But it doesn't actually correlate with nutritional status very well. But maybe the principle is a good one, and they've just tried to be oversimplistic. So this leads us into our new approach to what we're thinking about in Tartu, and as an idea for a new risk score for malnutrition based on clinical laboratory data that's already routinely collected. We've realized that it is definitely not possible to diagnose malnutrition or even malnutrition risk by relying on a single parameter. We've known for a long time that the albumin level doesn't give us that information. And the pre-albumin level is mostly not done, and also doesn't give that sort of information on its own. It's clearly important that if we're going to be successful with this, we need to look at lots of different parameters. And then if we've looked at lots of different parameters, we then need to give some sort of weighting to give more significance to the more important markers, and also to make sure that we're not kind of double counting. So we could look at the hemoglobin and the hematocrit, for example, and they would clearly be very similar to each other in the information they give us. We could look at lots of different inflammatory markers. So we could look at a high white cell count or a high CRP, and they would both tend to be high in a patient with inflammation, and it wouldn't be helpful to count both of them as they're independent parameters. But the idea of our thoughts are that we wouldn't do any extra testing, that we wouldn't do anything that hadn't already been done. So, study was designed and approved in the across the end of 2021 into 2022, and allowed us to propose this study. So the idea was that we would look at 300 patients from the internal medicine wards. The internal medicine wards chosen for two reasons. One, I work and the nutrition department is hosted within internal medicine, so that's easy and practical from our point of view, but also because we recognize internal medicine patients as being relatively high risk for malnutrition. So it would be much more difficult to do the study, say, in an ophthalmology unit where most of the patients don't have problems with malnutrition. And so typically we expect about 40% of our patients to have malnutrition or to be at high risk of malnutrition at the time they're admitted. So our idea was to get 300 patients as nearly consecutive as we could. And the only patients who were deliberately to be excluded were those for infection control reasons. And so most of this work was done when COVID was very active and we had lots of issues around infection control, and we felt that it was completely inappropriate to be putting either patients or medical staff, not just medical, but all the clinical staff, that we shouldn't be putting anyone at risk for a study of this sort. That does mean that we've got a slightly biased population in as much as we've deliberately excluded the COVID and COVID risk patients, but otherwise it's an all-comer study. And so the only other exclusions were patients that didn't consent, and that was about 8% of the total. What did we do? We did two established screening tools. I've told you a little bit about the NRS and what you need to do in order to achieve the full scoring from the NRS. We also used MUST, which is a quite similar scoring system that was devised in the UK, also is quite widely used around the world. So, and broadly similar. It's got a few subtle differences, but the basic principles behind it are the same. We also used two established diagnostic tools, the SGA, the Subjective Global Assessment, and GLIM, which are both intended to be able to make a diagnosis of malnutrition, not just to screen for it. And we did a review of all the blood tests. So all the blood tests that had been performed, we looked at. We didn't do any blood tests ourselves. We just looked at the results of the ones that had already been done at the time of the patient's admission. So data collection was through the middle of 2022, and we're now working on the analysis. So just to say a little bit more about the SGA and GLIM, Subjective Global Assessment looks at a variety of things, but it looks at them from the point of view of an expert, not someone who's just doing it as quickly as possible. And you get an overall assessment, A, B, or C, A being no or very low nutrition risk and B and C being worse. The global assessment is a similar sort of thing and gives you a score of 0, 1, or 2 for essentially normal nutrition, mild malnutrition, or severe malnutrition. And the current master's students are now involved in the study, first of all, by doing a critical review of the GLIM diagnostic process, which we think is flawed because we found important differences between SGA and GLIM. And we think the SGA is probably better, but GLIM is being suggested as something that should be taking over from it. And so we're looking at that critically. The current students are going to write a paper. Well, they've almost written it already. It will shortly be ready for submission for publication. And that will be an important part of their coursework, writing a proper review paper that will be published in one of the important scientific journals. We've also taken 200 patients from the full 300. We've selected them completely randomly in order to devise our own screening tool. And so the first thing we did is to make the random selection. So we've got 200 of the 300. We've then looked at all the tests, all the blood tests those patients had. And we removed from our consideration any tests that were performed in less than 60% patients. So if only one person in 100 had the test done, clearly that's not going to be very useful to us. So we're looking at tests that are done in most patients. That meant that there were 37 parameters left. So 37 things that are done in many, many patients that could potentially be of value in a nutrition diagnosis. Of those 200 patients, 110 had an SGA grade of A, so no special nutrition concerns. And that fits very well with our expectations of around about 40% in this group of patients. So 90% had an SGA of B or C, so 90% and roughly half and half, moderate malnutrition, severe malnutrition. And we use those gradings for comparative purposes. Our 37 parameters cluster really into three groups: red cell parameters, markers of inflammation, and some additional biochemical characteristics. And what we're doing at the moment is to engage in a succession of conventional statistical modeling using stepwise logistic regression and factor analysis. And those of you that know lots about statistics will know straight away what that is. And we're also adopting a machine learning approach, and we're doing this with another of our in fact, one of our medical students is running this part of the program as well. So we're looking at machine learning and conventional statistical modeling to see how we can come up with the best results. To give you an example, this is a part of a factor analysis showing one of the clusters that came up as being important. So we see there these are Z scores. So these are showing the amount of difference from the normal. And so the subjective global assessment is very much influenced by the red blood cell count with a Z score of 0.86. So that is a high correlation, it's a high linkage. And you'll see there's some other red cell characteristics there that are also strongly associated. When we look at the stepwise logistic regression, this is a so-called ROC curve, a reporter operating characteristic curve. And what you're looking for there is the sensitivity and the specificity of the test. So a perfect test has a sensitivity and a specificity of 100%. In other words, of all patients who've got the abnormality, the test will pick them up. So that's 100% sensitivity, and it won't pick up any false negatives sorry, any false positives. So it won't pick up anyone that hasn't got the problem, and it will pick up everyone that has got the problem. So that's a perfect test. You never get that in medicine. And you can see this curve here is actually our results. So preliminary, it's not the final analysis, but it's our first assessment. And so what you can see there, we clearly haven't got 100% sensitivity and 100% specificity. But what we have got, if we take the point nearest to that X, so that's perfect, and the point of our curve that is nearest to that is probably there, which is just the first draft. And that shows 76% sensitivity and 81% specificity. You might say, well, that doesn't sound wonderful, but actually that is better than any of the conventionally used markers. And this can be done completely automatically by the hospital laboratory computer. So it would be perfectly feasible for the computer simply to do this, to run the analysis on that group of 37 blood tests and to say, this patient is at high nutrition risk or isn't. No one needs to do anything. No one would need to remember to do anything, and no one would actually need to do anything, and yet this information would be there. That's the principle. We're looking at multiple models to see which is the best way. As I said, that's already pretty good, and that was just the first draft, looking very quickly at the first 200. Now, why have we got 200 and 100? The idea there is that we're devising the test on the 200. So we've parked the other 100. They're in a secret vault. We're not looking at those results at all, but we know that they are exactly comparable group of patients. There's no reason that those are different in any way. So that group of 100 is then going to be our check sample. When we've decided what our best option is, we will then run that best option in the 100 patients to see if we come up with the same sort of result. But even the most preliminary results are suggesting that this is looking very, very, very promising indeed. It also looks as though it may go beyond the screening expectation that it would identify people who have malnutrition or are at high risk, because there's a suggestion that might also provide a diagnosis of malnutrition, and that really would be very important and helpful indeed. So we're expecting high-ranking publications. So come back to the master's program. It is expected that all of our clinical nutrition students will make at least one presentation at a national meeting in Estonia, that they'll make at least one presentation at an international meeting, which is most likely to be the European Nutrition Congress, that they'll contribute to at least one scientific publication. That's our expectation for all the students in the module. And there's a reasonable opportunity that at least some of the students will be the principal first author of a publication as well. So, Tartu, main university city of Estonia. It will be the European City of Culture in 2024. The city is full of museums, theatres, concert halls, but it's also, as well as the cultural and artistic aspects, it's also great for sports, restaurants, shops, bars. You can go skiing when the weather's like this. You can go swimming in the river when it's nice and hot in the summer, or if you're one of these crazy people that goes ice swimming, you can do that in the winter as well. Who's the master's for? It's suitable for anyone with a healthcare background. We're open to interest from scientists, nurses, vets, even doctors. And I like this slide because this gives an indication of the multidisciplinary approach. I was given this, I mean, obviously it's not an original cartoon, and I was given this cartoon by one of my colleagues in London, who said that she thought it represented very well our nutrition team focus, and that she felt that everyone in the team was represented there somewhere, but I didn't like to ask which one she thought was me. But we do have exams, so the master's is taken seriously. We do have exams, but we also try to make sure that even when we have exams, that they are treated a little bit lightly. And so the examination for the course students at the moment, their multiple choice question paper shortly before Christmas, we ran as a formal multiple choice question, but the assessment was done as space-themed snakes and ladders with some mince pies to go with it. And you can see that Greta in the middle there was the one who won. So I hope that this has been interesting for people. I hope that I've talked for a reasonably helpful amount of time with an appropriate amount of detail. We'd love you to come and join us. And that's true specifically in terms of the master's course, but also applies to anyone that's interested in clinical, laboratory, research or educational aspects where we could work together and look at clinical nutrition together. So I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you, and I'd be very happy to address any questions that we've got. And so if we go back to the original screen and see what we've got. I obviously haven't had a chance to look at the question and answers, but I know it did ping a couple of times, so I know that at least one or two people have asked questions. So let's go from there. What can I say?
Okay, thank you so much, Alastair, for this exciting talk. As you already said, now it is time for some questions from our audience. And just a reminder, please type your questions to the Q&A box. And I will just start from the first one. So are there exchange opportunities, and would you recommend to go on exchange to a partner university?
Okay, so the university here in Tartu is very much engaged in the Erasmus program. So there are lots of opportunities for exchanges between the other universities involved in Erasmus. So yes, for sure. I think I mentioned right at the very beginning that our course is creating 120 of these European transferable credits. And so the whole point of that is that if you've done credits in another university that's in the scheme, that those count for credits in Tartu, but equally our credits in Tartu count for credits if you want to go to Copenhagen or Rotterdam or Seville. So it works very well within Europe. So exchange opportunities within Europe, definitely. If it's my only reservation about that in terms of our course is that our course is actually quite a heavily integrated one in terms of what we do in the first year at any rate. And the first year really does take quite a systematic approach. And it would be a shame really to do a couple of months of it and miss the rest. When it comes to the second year, then that's not a problem at all, because the second year is very much focused on the research project, and in any case we're almost intending that people should do that at least in an identifiable separate department. Even if it was in Tartu, we'd still be very happy for them to be outside nutrition while they're doing that. So yes, we're keen on the opportunities for swapping, mixing and matching with other degree programs, so long as it makes sense. So there needs to be a bit of give and take there.
Okay, thank you. So the next question says, thank you for the interesting presentation. And what?
Oh yeah, so what's the average intake? Okay, yeah. so well, this is a bit of a loaded question. The course only started this September, so we're still in the first year, and quite a number of things conspired against recruitment, the COVID in particular, because that meant that a lot of our recruitment activities weren't possible. Then on top of that, we had the slight difficulties that some of you might have noticed in Ukraine, which meant that we immediately lost the Russian participants that we were expecting to have, and one Ukrainian. So we ended up this year, and it's a little bit embarrassing, but we've only had ended up with 3 students this year, which was definitely less than we were anticipating and hoping for. Our ambition had been for there to be 10 students in the first year. I think the ideal number for the sort of course that we're running and the way we're doing it, I think the ideal is probably something in the region of 20. And already this year, I've got expressions of interest from 21 people, actually 22 people. And I know that not all of those will come, but we're only just over a week into the submission process, so there's another 2 months during which people can express their interest and make their applications. I'm very hopeful that we will get to somewhere around that 20 level. The limit is 30. So we're intending not to have more than 30 people. So if we get to 30, then we will stop recruitment, because I know that I can't give a personal interaction to more than 30 students. I know that from my experiences with the London course, which now has 160 people each year. I wanted to call them patients, they're not quite patients. So 160 it's impossible to provide a personal course with 160 students. I think with up to 30, we can give that. We can do that. We can know who the students are, know their names, know what their background is, what their personal ambitions are. And so I think, you know, if we end up with somewhere between 20 and 30, that will be perfect. It also means that if we've got that number of people, it means the course has a bigger income, which means that we can then be more generous in terms of other invited speakers, so we can have more invited speakers. It means that we can arrange day trips and so on. I mean, we've already done that to a certain extent by making sure that the students can take part in the national nutrition meetings. So ESPEN, which is the Estonian Clinical Nutrition Society, has meetings 3-4 times a year, and we're making sure that the students go to those meetings, and that's all paid for out of the course resources and so on. So we're keen that we should be able to retain and be able to do that sort of thing.
Yes, thank you. I think after this webinar, many more applications are.
Oh, I hope so.
on the way.
What
Yes.
else have we got?
Tell
us about the admission interview. Okay, so the admission interview. So anyone that makes an application is first of all vetted by the admissions office, and I don't even get to see those at that stage. And so someone that hasn't got a degree, doesn't speak English, or thinks that they're applying to do something that's going to teach them Swahili, those are all taken out of the system before I ever see them. The ones that I get to see are the ones that are essentially more or less satisfying the university's general requirements. And I then look at those to see whether the course is likely to provide the sort of thing that the student's looking for. And generally speaking, people are sensible and they've looked at enough at what information we've provided, and they've said, yeah, this is something I want to do. And we can say, yeah, that looks as though that would suit you. Occasionally someone comes to me with questions. I say, look, you know, I think probably it might be the right thing for you, but maybe not this year. You know, there are other things that you could usefully do beforehand. And that can be particularly true for someone who isn't terribly strong in English. And I had some bad experiences in London with Chinese students who are very clever, but really, really struggled with their English. And it made it very difficult for them to take the full advantage of the course. So it didn't matter terribly to us, but it was terribly difficult for them. And they would have been far better off if they'd spent even 3 months doing an intensive English course and then come on our course. And so there are occasions like that where I'll say to someone, you know, I think actually, you know, really work hard on your English and come next year. So there are occasions like that. But once the people have got through that process, everyone has an assessment by my team, and that consists of 2 things. It consists of us looking at the motivational statement that the university asks you to write, and it also consists of an interview. And last year, it was inevitable that the interviews were going to be online because of COVID. I think actually I'm going to keep to that this year, and we'll do all the interviews online this year as well, because it actually makes it much more practical, particularly if someone's applying from Nigeria. You know, we can't really expect someone to come to Tartu for an interview on the off chance that they might or might not get onto our course. So we'll do all, and if we're doing the ones from Nigeria online, we should also do the ones from Estonia online, so that it's fair, so that we're doing the same thing for different people. So the interviews will be online. We've actually got a date for the interviews. The interviews will be in the week which begins, I think it's the 21st of April, but if there's a Monday that's approximately the 21st of April, that week will be the interview. So we've already got that date fixed. And so all the interviews will be that week. And everyone will be interviewed by me with at least one other member of the team. And we'll judge from the interview in combination with the motivational statement. And we'll actually use the motivational statement as part of the interview, so the two sort of come together. And that then gives us an opportunity to say to the university, yeah, we'd like to have this person on the course, and generally speaking, that then happens.
Okay, thank you. So since we have to finish soon, I think we will take the last question. And let's take this question. Will this course be useful for people involved in fitness and sport, or does it involve more clinical aspects?
It is intended to be clinical nutrition for patients. So that's the focus, and it would be wrong of me to say that it would be the perfect thing for someone who's interested in sports nutrition. We have a sports nutrition module, but that's probably not more than a 20th of year one. So it's quite a small component. Now, of course, if someone already knows a great deal about sport nutrition and doesn't know anything about clinical nutrition, that could still be a very good reason for that person coming on the course and benefiting from it. So it's not to say automatically it would be a bad thing, but if someone is just beginning to be interested in nutrition because they're interested in sport, I think there are probably better choices for them to make, to be honest. Not least the fact that there's a very good master's program in sports medicine here in Tartu. So I don't want to steal their people later.
Okay, great. I believe we covered most of the questions from our audience.
What I would say is that anyone that's got any questions that we haven't covered, or indeed the question that you only think about tomorrow, it's a very simple thing for us to be in contact by email. And have we given them an access point that will continue once the webinar finishes?
The email will go to everyone.
Okay, so everyone gets the email. If there's any questions that you've got, then please send the questions to that email. That will then come to me, or if it's something more directly related to the admissions procedure, then maybe to the admissions office. But then we can answer those questions. So anything that we haven't addressed that you want to know, by all means get in touch. My email address is simply my name, alastair.forbes@ut.ee, like all the other university addresses. So the only difficulty you've got there is working out how you spell my name.
Yes. So as already Alastair mentioned, that there is going to be a virtual meeting with Alastair, where you can ask any questions you have regarding the program, and we will send everyone here today the information along with the recording of today's talk. And I also wanted to say that if you are a future student and planning to apply to clinical nutrition program this year, then the application period has already started and the deadline is on 15 March. And yes, so thanks to our audience for being with us today. I would like to thank our presenter, Alastair, for sharing his experience and for a great talk on an interesting topic. And yes, so thank you again to everybody. Thank you, Alastair, and I wish you a nice evening.
Thank you, and my best wishes to everyone. Thanks very much. It's been fun.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye then.